All right, welcome to this beautiful time together of sharing in a feast of ideas and thoughts and dreams and possibilities. We're gathering here today to talk about grief and sanctuary, and grief as sanctuary, and what does this mean? So we'll be having an emergent conversation together. The four of us, myself, Holly, Amy, Bio, we are connected by Únashay, which is a grief sanctuary that is in Tewa lands in Abiquiu, in New Mexico. And so we'll also be talking about what a grief sanctuary is and how our capacity to envision new ways to collectively grieve might be one of the most relevant threads of sanity we have right now, might be a gift and a pathway of liberation. And so this is what we'll be up to today. I'll just introduce everyone real quickly. We have Amy Wilson here. Can you raise your hand, Amy, or give a little? Yeah. Amy is the visionary of Únashay, land tender, incredible artist, and the executive director of Únashay Home. We have Holly Trular.
Hey there.
Holly is a grief therapist, a ritualist, a community organizer, incredible artist of human connection. So thanks for being here, Holly. Yeah. And we have Dr. Bio Akumulafe. I'm going to give a little wave, Bio.
Hello.
Bio is a widely celebrated speaker, teacher, thought provocateur, father. And I'm so happy that you're here with us, Bio. Thank you. And I'm Jessie Ratto. I'm also on the board for Únashay. I'm an integrative artist. I'm also a therapist working with grief and community singing, actually. And so I'm going to be hosting us today. All right, let's dive in. So I'm wondering, I just gave little brief intros, but I'm actually wondering if we can open a little space for everyone to introduce themselves. Maybe a way that you want to be seen today, or perhaps something you want to share about what drew you to the particular project of Únashay, of a grief sanctuary in the desert. A way I'd like to ask the question is with an imaginative kind of musing. So I'm wondering if we can all just imagine that the four of us are being tasked, in fact, with organizing a grief sanctuary together. And it's, in fact, right now, full of grievers. So we're in the desert together right now, you can imagine. And I'm wondering, what is your role? Give us a picture of what you're doing right now in this grief sanctuary. And I'm happy to just briefly kick us off by saying I'm absolutely organizing morning and evening singing. You'll probably find me singing to the hills and the river and the moon regularly. I'm probably taking folks into guided rest spaces so they can be soft with themselves and meet the quiet. And I'm likely not cooking for anyone. What are you up to?
Oh, Amy, you go.
Okay. That's such a cool question. And I feel like I'm a mix of both playing with our guests, and likely that will include my dogs and running around and cuddling and chasing after them. And then I think also song is very much involved with that. And then I think, yeah, there's just like a very root, like primal space in me that I feel like I'm trying to find ways to invite people in to be seen, to be heard, whether it's in the acute, raw space of just needing to be witnessed and accompanied through their darkest, whatever they're moving through, and or the playful side, or the whole spectrum of grief, because it's not just this notion, I feel, of what we deem as like this dark thing to go through, or this awful experience. So, but yeah, figuring out ways to call in the human more than human presence, so that we can just see each other through this and scream and cry and play with each other through it. So yeah.
I think I might say something here.
Yeah.
Uh, I've just noticed quite almost surprisingly that my internet connection is glitchy, and I've been told by the reception in the hotel I'm at somewhere here in Connecticut that I should expect more glitches, and that feels quite poetically appropriate to my work. So, to respond to my sister's invitation to position ourselves somewhere in the desert, I think I'll be somewhere where the desert meets the highway, right? And where glitches appear, where the glitch appears, where drivers are riding straight, driving straight, and perhaps I'll be alive to moments when their vehicles of progress break down. I'll be there at their doors to say, hey, you don't, it doesn't have to be this linear street that you're on. Why don't you take a break? Why don't you step off from your cleanliness? And I would libate their feet with dust. I guess that would be my attraction or my gift to the moment. So that's how I want to see myself, as as a poet of glitches, and then a Pied Piper away from the exhaustion of the highway. Yep.
Thanks.
These are also beautiful. All praise the poets. First off, couldn't make it through these times and grief without poets, singers, the beauty being brought in. Yeah, I think similarly to each of you in ways, I really kind of inhabit these thresholds. And so, really helping people to feel comfortable in these, or uncomfortable, helping people to sit with the comfort and discomfort in these kind of threshold times and spaces. And I think whenever I'm doing grief work, I always think about ritual, and I always think about building containers that can hold this. And for me, whenever we're bringing ritual in, there's just a deep listening that needs to happen. I tell this story sometimes when I'm teaching groups around ritual. I just got done with a grief ritual training. And when I first started working with Francis Weller, I was working on a ritual with him. And I said something like, I was like, well, we're just making this up anyways. And his face, like, in the nicest way possible, just kind of dropped. And he was like, no, that's not what's happening. Right? Like, ritual is coming through the land, through the ancestors to us. And so for me, there's a piece of really deeply listening to what's wanting to come through in this specific place with these specific people. And then also, I'm a Capricorn, and I'm just really good at building scaffolding. So the way in which, like, being able to put a ritual together and say, okay, here's a container that might be able to hold this. And if it cracks, we also have Bio and Amy and Jesse all to help kind of hold that and really be with whatever wants to come through. So I love this question, and I love imagining all the beings that aren't here on this call and what they would be bringing into.
Great. Thanks for jumping into that fantasy with me. It, in fact, is not a fantasy. We will actually all be together next month, April 20th of 2024. Únashay will be hosting a beautiful land-based fundraiser. So we will be at the Grief Sanctuary. Bio will be giving a talk. Holly will be leading a land-based ritual, and I'll be guiding some community singing. Amy is going to be welcoming us just to this beautiful land that they've been giving their whole being to for many years now. And we have many more incredible folks who will be gathering, like some really really incredible beings. So more on that later on how to attend or support this collective effort from afar. Okay, so given that we're up to this work, something draws us to this. I'm hoping to just give a little, maybe it's not little, huh? I'm hoping to open up a little bit of like a net or a framework on what we mean when we're talking about grief. And I'm actually wanting to use the invitation of something that has made sense to me through my experience with grief, which is grief as an initiation. So in maybe dominant culture, mainstream culture, I was really taught to see grief as something bad that happens to you. And learning my shift out of that was really big. It was life altering for me. So I'm wondering about grief not as a bad thing that happens to you, but as a portal that we enter, or a territory with a threshold that we cross into. And that people who work with grief, people who draw near grief, have been initiated or at least gone through some sense of initiation. So if I wonder, does that idea resonate with you? And the question would be, how are you initiated by grief? Why are you here doing this work right now? When did you enter the territory? Or why do you find yourself still in this territory?
There's a sense in which grief is scandalous to modernity as a project. And I'm going to qualify modernity by saying white modernity. There's a sense in which it is revolting. And there's a reason probably why it intervenes and interrupts modalities of productivity, right? It gets in the way. It muddies things too much. And maybe this is the reason why the DSM-5 has pathologized grieving for a time, right? If you grieve for more than a year, then there's up to a year, there's something wrong here with you. I've always thought of grief as decolonial. My practice, I was trained as a clinical psychologist, and as I deepened my work and I grew in the ranks, so to speak, of expertise, I started to notice quite critically how missing spaces to grieve were, right? It was easier to shrink, so to speak, using that stereotypic designation, to fix a problem, to diagnose, to pathologize, than to actually have the kind of sweltering, abundant, generous space for grieving, right? So while I grew in the ranks, I started to turn and pay attention to softer indigenous cosmologies of grieving, a way of holding loss as part of life, right? That loss wasn't the outlier. Loss innervates and threads through a rich and healthy fabric of what it means to be alive and what it means to live and die well. This was rather foreign to me because I was raised Christian, and my training in clinical psychology didn't expose me to this kind of thought. So I started to pay attention to that. I remember my father passing away, and I think I was about 15 or so, and then I saw women in the village rolling in the dirt, and I felt it was extravagant and irritating to me because I felt they didn't know my father. Why all this elaborate display? It's almost too theatrical to be authentic. But my value of authenticity was secreted by modernity, right? Authenticity is a modern value. We have to stay true within our lanes of identity. That's a very modern modern way of seeing bodies and their relations with the world. I digress. I started to understand slowly that this so-called performative display of grieving was a celebration at a deeper level than I could understand, that it was a way of holding space for loss, because our bodies are indebted to loss. And so this is how I want to signal or mark grief, that grief is a kind of debt. It's an indebtedness to ecological flows, is an indebtedness to cosmological events. It's a punctuation in the highway of credits, the way we track and measure bodies and corporealize bodies is with a credit system, almost synonymous with how the university tracks knowledge, by assigning credits, right? Grief is blackness, grief is debt, grief punctures and interrupts that. And I think the kind of animacy and joy and celebration and paying attention to and experimentation at the edges of the credit is exactly what grief does. So grief is a call to stay with the trouble of, it's not just crying, that's reductionistic. It's not just crying, it's not just being sad, it's staying with our limitations. And there's something that happens when we do that.
A call to stay with the trouble and with our limitations.
Yeah, what I hear you speaking to, Bio, is grief as aliveness, right? Which I think is really beautiful. And Jesse, when you ask this question around initiation, I love this framework because the way I've been taught about initiation is that it's a very real encounter with death. That could be death of self, death of someone else, or death of what we know, right? But what we know is that when initiation happens, our life will never be the same. We can't go back to our life the way it was before. And I'm saying that because I'm not saying you're doing this, but sometimes when people are like, "Oh, we're just in a collective initiation," or "It's not that bad," I'm like, "Whoa, initiation is actually really hard." And in indigenous cultures where there is planned initiation, village held initiation, some people don't come back. Like it is a real encounter with death. Now, what we have a lot in the over culture is rough initiation, right? It's an uncontained encounter with death, which is traumatic, which is harder than a contained encounter with death, than having a village that's holding you through that. But just to say, there's a lot that comes from being initiated, a lot of good, a lot of relationality, right? We become an adult. We step over the threshold of only worrying about ourselves and we start to worry about the wider world. We start to feel our entanglement with all that is. That's beautiful. And it's fucking hard, right? And so I just want to also bring that in and be like, yeah, grief is aliveness. It is beautiful. And for those of us that have really been in it, like have lost people incredibly close to us, are watching what's happening in the world, it's also devastating. And it's supposed to be devastating, right? And how do we embrace that? So I'll leave it there for now.
Mm.
I mean, I feel very deeply of all that you all are saying. And I think what I would add is just, I've come to this work more through a visceral space than it being a good idea, or, it was not at all in a mental, or I'd say it didn't come from the mental space. It was more of just this visceral need through my own initiation with grief. And while I could speak to sudden losses that I went through with my mother and dearest brother, friend, within a year's time. And those, like, they surely did kind of rip open the whole experience. But I've been kind of in this work since I was a kid. I feel like Jesse, who's known me for over 20 years now, could speak to that, but it's always been deeply close to me. Um, and then I think when I went through these losses 6 years ago, I mean, it's as simple as just me. This is how I love them, like the ones that I've lost. This is how I love the land, how I love, like, it's the initiation is an ongoing, just, it's like getting in the water every morning and participating with the flow of life, which, as you've spoken to, like, as we've all said, it's like, it's not what modernity sees it as, this thing to be fixed, this pathological linear experience that needs to be corrected. If anything, it's plunging us into a deeper tidal force of being that wants to come through us. So, as shitty as it has felt, and yes, it's I speak to all of, like, the whole spectrum of it being devastating and hard and all of that. And it's kind of like if I were to try to find like a visceral explanation, it's like a body of water I can't get out now. Like, I love it too. Like, it's like swimming in the ocean, that, like, there's so much life in it, and we've barely brushed the surface of what lies below and what wants to come up. So yeah, and in that, I'm loving, like, it's my way of loving my friend and my mother, and yeah, everything that I have, like, I realized it's not just the simple flat experience of, oh, they died, I've lost them. Like, no, we're in constant relationship, and as I explore that ocean more, I feel like I'm close with them, and yeah, like, in feeding, like what bio speaks to with the indebtedness that we have, that, like, it's in that act of feeding it that I am fed and nourished back. So it's just, yeah, it's a very symbiotic relationship. Yeah.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, I'm hearing, I feel like we're talking about a wild animal, or a force of nature here. Um, and I'd love to just share something personal, actually, that um, came through last night. I was at home preparing for this conversation, and I had a memory come through. And Amy, this actually, I want to tell you this because, like you said, we've known each other for, some decades now. I've watched Únashay give birth to itself through profound losses in your life, and we've lost significant people. We've witnessed each other lose significant people. And so, but this backs up before, to actually right when I first met you, when and it was right as I lost my beautiful, vibrant, kind father. um, and that loss was really my portal into grief. And during that loss, I was so I was so disoriented because I needed to wail and I didn't know where to do it. And we were acknowledging and honoring my dad, but there was no actual space to do what my body felt like it wanted to do. I needed to move something, and I had never seen whatever I was feeling, I hadn't seen it yet. And so it started to kind of coalesce into depression for me. It started to just harden in me, or like it gets stuck. And I felt like I was speaking a language that no one else was speaking in the world. And I felt alone and in that. And something happened during that time. I said to myself, this is so strange saying this now, when I remembered it last night, it shocked me. I said to myself, when the grief did start to move, when I found the channels for it to move, I said, I'll never, if I ever experience grief like that again, I'll never let it get to that point where it starts to to get stagnant. And if that's starting to happen, And this is what I said to myself. If that's starting to happen, I'm going to take myself to the desert of New Mexico to wail on the earth. I've
Well,
never even been to New Mexico. So I just wanted to share that as right now as just sort of like a living piece of whatever this dream is that we're all threading through, that somehow, even
yeah.
in the wisdom, even in my own grieving of what was to come.
Mm.
And so this feels like a place to ask this question. This conversation is called Grief as Sanctuary. What does this mean?
Yeah.
How do we build living culture around grief?
Well, I just want to say first, I love, Jesse, what you're talking about of keeping the grief warm, being in relationship with it and keeping it moving, right? And we're partially talking about alchemy here and having and applying enough heat to the vessel, having enough so that it doesn't congeal and then can alchemize into something really beautiful, which I think is so fitted too. Because when I think about the desert, there's a certain amount of heat that happens in the desert. So I just love that. And I'm happy to hear what anybody else wants to say about sanctuary, or I can share.
Please go ahead and share, sister.
Yeah, when I think about sanctuary, especially in these times, there's a few things that come up for me, but one is what I've been practicing for the last 3 years, which is really building a house of belonging for each other in an overculture where we're really taught that we don't belong, and we're really taught that the outcast parts of us, the parts that are outcasts in the overculture, the people that are on the fringes, really are purposely told we don't belong. So what I have been really trying to do and have been taught to do is, how do we welcome all these parts in? How do we welcome each other and really build a place of belonging for each other? There's a David White poem called The House of Belonging, or and it's beautiful, but it actually takes practice. And so for me, sanctuary A is a verb, right? That we're having to do with each other over and over and over again. And when I say belonging, I also mean our belonging to the earth, our belonging to the cosmos, with our ancestors, with our grief. So there's a big piece in there for me around that. And it also makes me think of this concept of refugia that I learned from my friend Erin Giesemann Rapke, who you know well, bio. That's like a scientific term when there's these areas that are very desolate. So I think this got named when there was a volcano eruption and there was just everything was kind of decimated. But when they went in there, they found these little pockets of um, aliveness, these little pockets of life and places that were fecund. And I think of that we are trying to build these spaces of refugia in a place where a lot of it isn't safe, right? And then the last part that comes up for me is really around like who gets sanctuary, what sanctuary means for different people. And I think about this as when we talk about sanctuary cities, actual cities that it seems absurd to me that there are cities that have to say like, we're a sanctuary city. We're not going to come after these people, after minorities, things like that. But I think it's an important thing, at least for me, to sit with. And I know that for Únashay, it's really important to say, like, how do we make sanctuary as accessible as possible, whether that is an actual land base or just this concept of like, how do we build these houses of belonging in these threshold times? So I'll leave it at that.
How about you, Bio? I know that you
Yeah,
talk about this often.
I'm almost hesitant to speak because I've been frozen many times already, but I'm gonna take it. So let's see. If I'm frozen, please just keep the conversation going and forget about me. Um, but when I speak about sanctuary, I what comes to mind are the medieval practices of forging sanctuaries, right? Many people were accused of being witches or killing, as you know, Salem, Massachusetts, all of that. People will be accused, and the church at that time borrowed from pagan practices this idea of claiming sanctuary. So they would allow someone who has been accused a space of rest. And this was performed by the person holding an aspect of the church and claiming sanctuary, of course. And they would let this fugitive in and grant the person some space of rest contingent upon their accepting Jesus Christ. And then they will be sent on exile, right? They were rarely allowed back into society because their accusers were probably at the gates waiting to hack them to death, right? Of course, we don't claim sanctuary these days. We just hire lawyers. The juridical landscapes has changed. But this idea of making sanctuary, to me, speaks very deeply to the kinds of needs and the kinds of flows that are still afoot. So sanctuary to me is not a performance of safety per se, not our safety. It's more for me about meeting the fugitive, right? Meeting the nomad, meeting the person that has been accused. Grief is the accused here, right? Grief is always nomadological. Grief is not part of settlement. We don't know how to make grief a citizen, right? So we pathologize it, we otherize it, we externalize it. So grief passes through, and loss is the trajectory, the cartography of grief. Now, I feel making sanctuary, not claiming sanctuary now, but making sanctuary is about ecologies of practice and experimentation that make welcome this fugitive. So it's less about safety and more about forging strange alliances with the alien, with the nomad that is passing through. So it doesn't take a standardized form at all. It really is, how do we hold space? How do we make welcome this very, very irritating migrant, right? How do we make space for grief? How do we hold space for loss? And why this is emancipatory is because white modernity is founded on its myth of permanence, right? Our architecture is a display of permanence. The skyscrapers, all the concrete utopias that we build, there are ways that we're signaling our tethering to permanence, right? This is how grief, as a trickster, undoes that permanence. It invites loss in. It says, nah, you don't want to stay put in that utopian project. So making sanctuary is decolonial, post-colonial, post-human, post-activist, and potentially a work in forging new ecological alliances with other spaces of power. Wow, that happened without a glitch so far. So
Bio, every time you've spoken, it's been totally clear. So I
There's no
just want to
glitches for
say
us.
there is a wildness happening. I want to say too, Bio, I love what you're saying around welcoming this wildness in. I think it's so much of what we need to do right now. And I co-facilitate a group called Soulful Life. And right now we're doing Tending the Threshold. That's like the theme we're doing. Your work is being called in a lot because you write so much about thresholds and the cracks. But on Wednesday, part of what we're doing is we're actually embodying wild animal leaders in order to ward off the predator being this archetypal energy that's really a death energy, not our friend. We're not befriending the predator, but we are befriending the monsters and these animals, and we're like literally embodying them and going to dance and pretend, or not even, I don't want to say pretend, we're going to meld with these animals in this wildness, right? I'm really into right now practicing that sort of less containment, more wildness, and how we let that come through. So I just want to say your work is coming through that a lot. Queer Nature's work is coming through that a lot. We're really queering the threshold in these times. So thanks for that.
maybe I'll just piggyback on those comments from my sister Holly, that the way that I feel making sanctuary plays out is it a becoming, like you said, becoming animal. It's shape shifting. It's about shape shifting, and shape shifting is becoming responsive to loss, right? We cannot hold. This is the reason why I've written elsewhere that grief is mutiny. It's mutiny against the rectilinear shape of the proper citizen. There's something about grief that forces us into the fetal position. It's almost like it wants to germinate something else, a new kind of body. So shape shifting is making sanctuary. Yes.
Mhm. Yeah, that's a great, it's such an interesting line, I think, culturally, because we're really safety focused and obsessed sometimes, and safety is basic and important, and also there's a way in which it's this like yeah, sometimes obsession feels antithetical to what life actually is. And so we keep pushing against something that is just it's not its nature actually to be fully inherently safe, except that somehow we're a part of. And so there is a way we're safe in resting into what we are never separated from. So I love this kind of shaking this up a little bit around what, safe spaces, well-held spaces. But as far as the transformation you experience, as far as what that then asks of us in our life, what that changes, we don't know. We don't actually know who we're becoming. We don't know what's emerging. And that's really vital to be in touch with that. Something that comes up a lot when I'm in counseling practice is to say to people, honestly, I don't actually know what will happen for you if you experience change. It's not my business. And I have to say, sometimes change is incredibly disruptive. The life you have right now may not feel relevant to you in the same way. And I'm sorry to say that, but that's true. You may walk away from things that you thought you were holding on to so tightly. And so this is, the willingness to come into terrain that we don't actually have the map. We are in some ways willfully losing the maps. We're sort of like burning them as we go, or leaving them behind and letting them disintegrate in the water, in the river of our tears, or whatever else, the fire of our transformation. It takes courage.
Yeah. And I feel the paradox in what you're saying too, like, we don't know what the trajectory is that gives, like, in terms of just someone who is grieving, whether it's the loss of a loved one or the state of the planet right now in the world, it's giving us permission to shapeshift in our grief, to let out the deeper cry or the deeper whatever trickster playful energy. Like, and I feel, yeah, there's just so much cultural fear and control of releasing into those deeper waters of grief because we don't know where it's going. And I also acknowledge, I think, seeing it from more of an aerial view of how the system is built, or I should say not built, to be a vessel or to be present with grief. It makes sense why people are so afraid to release into it, because I don't feel our current culture and system knows how to meet it. And then that exacerbates more fear and control around it. And that, I think, the work of Únashay, what's so alive for me, is exploring these realms of how do we build a well-held vessel, like a vessel that it's not necessarily quote unquote safe, but it's still like firmly like holding our guest, and it's meeting them in that sort of relinquished space of like, we don't know what's going to happen, and we want to explore and travel this with you, and yeah, it's both coming from like visceral, I think acknowledging like the personal. That's all I wished for when I was moving through my experience. And a part of why my dear friend passed so soon is because he just was not held in the cult, in the system, as so many of us aren't. So yeah.
I just want
Yeah,
to,
go ahead.
oh, I just want to name, Amy, I feel like you keep bringing this up, which I love, is, well, we all are, is the way in which people who are initiated by grief, sometimes I think of it as being befriended by grief, but um, are part of this great clan of the brokenhearted. And when I think of that, I love that term because I think of all these people on a pilgrimage together. This clan, really, that I don't know about you all, but I can really feel when somebody has been deeply in grief, and maybe when someone, I think all humans in these times have felt grief. But I think there are obviously people who have more deeply experienced loss. And I can really feel that. I can really feel when somebody, like, I'm like, oh, we're a part of the same clan. And I think we're all kind of touching on that too. And when you can feel that with another and have a space for that, I think that is when more of the wildness can come through. I think that is when that full expression can come through. And I guess part of what I love about Únashay is it's a place where this great clan can meet together. It's a meeting space for all these sort of wild and sometimes lost broken hearts.
This feels really up right now also as more people are finding their activism, their participation, their the necessity of their voice and their themselves in these times. And I'm wondering, you know, the pace of that work sometimes is moving so rapidly, and I wonder, like, how are we figuring out what to do? Like, how and are we leaving space to grieve? You know, as we're tuning into what's happening around us, like, are we valuing the space to grieve? So, I guess where I kind of want to go next is to maybe touch a little more on this, like the uninitiated soul. And this comes from a conversation that Holly and Amy and I had. And I'm wondering, Bio, how's your connection? Are you able to catch this part?
I think I'm still solid for
Okay,
now.
great. Okay, so I'll just give a little context. We had a conversation that led really emergently into what I'm languaging as the uninitiated soul. So it's like, I see so many people around me asking, like, what is happening right now? Like, what's going on with people? Like, and feeling genuine confusion and fear about that. What's happening? Where are we going? Who are we? What are we? Great questions, and ones that don't have answers, as we're talking about here, this fruitful confusion, this disorientation in order to be oriented by something larger. So I'm wondering if we could just touch on what is, are we living amidst uninitiated soul work? And is there is there a demand or a request being made of us right now to mature? How might grief might be a part of a maturing process for the soul, for souls? And again, take any part of that framework that resonates or not, just a jumping off point for us here. I wonder, Bio, you were smiling. What's resonant for you?
I smile because, yeah, um, I don't know why I'm smiling. I think it's just the right thing to do here. Those questions are very, very interesting. What are we doing now? Where are we going? Who are we now? I think of this is what I theorize as white syncopation. That is, and I don't want to go deep into rhythm theory or music theory to explore how syncopation disturbs, you know, pre-relational tendencies of the world to repeat itself. But these syncopating flows are disturbing the boundaries of what we once knew as normal and normative. It's like the myth of modernity is that we are isolated and that we are alone and that we're separate and separable, and that your feelings are yours and my feelings are mine, and never the twain shall meet because we are indeed ontologically separate. And then in comes this mass disabling event, which tracks along with the flows of grief and loss. Like, and something about the architecture of how we make home is disrupted. How we think of ourselves, how we think of identity, all of that is disrupted. Sherry Mitchell, my dear sister, once spoke about how she would pull to the side of the road and just start to cry, and she wouldn't know why she's crying, but she would sense that maybe I'm feeling the grief of a whale losing her child, right? Maybe we are now sensorially alive in ways that weren't possible before. That the world is in such flux now that we are picking up and sensing other griefs that are not ours. You know, grief is now this affective territoriality, and it is enlisting us in different ways. So those questions feel like they feel exactly pertinent. They feel like the kinds of phenomena that would emerge in a time of searching and confusion, which is the reason why making sanctuary and grief as sanctuary is necessary at this time. Not to go back to some notion of indigeneity, right? That is often romanticized by modern arrangements, right? Let's go back to the way things were. I think that's an abuse to indigenous cosmology, right? As if it were stable in the past. No, it's not about going to the past. It's what are we open to today? How are we listening? What questions are emerging right now? And Jesse, you said something quite beautiful about saying to your clients that I don't know where this is going to lead. That is the kind of work. It doesn't come down to some category of safety or even healing, because healing can become insidious. I mean, Black bodies know about safety as a way to entrap stolen African bodies in the slave ship. Safety was a net to keep them in the ship. Healing can often maintain traumatic continuity. And so it's over here. I think we are, these new questions are cartographies in themselves, and they're invitations for us to sit together and think together and cry together and laugh together, but forge ecologies of possibilities together.
I love that. Just the invitation of what questions are emerging right now. Can we just have the courage to sit in questions?
I love this line of questioning, and I love that it connects into everything else we've been saying. I think a part of what we're being initiated into, as we've all been speaking to, is like a post-human identity. And I find that really alive. I find that really juicy. I have an affinity, more than an affinity, for donkeys. And I often think of myself as like part donkey, part witch, part donkey, growing into that. And what does that mean? And what is my commitment to donkey consciousness, equine consciousness? But like, what do donkeys, or for someone else, it might be whales, right? Or a certain
Ollie,
tree.
I want to hear you laugh maybe soon.
Have you heard a donkey bray? It sounds like a grief call. It sounds like a grief wail. Donkey brays are pretty intense, you know? But like that to me is is part of the path. I don't know the entire path, of course, but I know it's not just centered around humans for sure. And I know that we are evolving into something. We are initiating into something more entangled, right? And so the other piece of this question around the uninitiated soul, I don't know if a soul can be uninitiated. I know a person can. I don't know. But what I know is that because we're in a space, because we're not doing initiations as a culture, most of us don't have a living culture, the soul will find a way to evolve. The soul will find a way to do the work it's meant to do, right? So this is happening through a lot of rough initiations right now, which could be death loss. It is what's happening in the collective. It is the violence. And I also believe that part of why we don't have often enough adults in the room is because we lack initiations, understandings around initiations. So, as I said earlier, a lot of initiation that's happening is actually quite traumatic. And so then we're dealing with this trauma sort of on top of these initiatory experiences. And all trauma contains grief. Not all grief contains trauma, but all trauma contains grief. And so, as Bio was saying earlier, there's this indebtedness of grief, but it's like we're banking a lot of grief here. And if we could figure out a way, if we could come together and say, how can we consciously do some initiation, go to the underworld and back and have psychopomps that are helping us to do this, I think we would be able to metabolize the grief a bit easier. That's not to say it wouldn't be wild. That's not to say it wouldn't be hard. That's just to say it wouldn't be so backlogged. Like our debt wouldn't be so high. Right now, our debt is really high, but that's all connected to initiation. And then when I'm talking about adulthood, right, crossing this threshold into adulthood through initiation, the like next step is elderhood. And I like to think of elders as sanctuary, like as living sanctuary. So that's a whole other conversation to be had. But the part that brings me the most alive, as you can tell, is really like, what is the post-human identity? What does that mean to evolve with other beings in a very real way? And I think that's also a piece around like what it means to follow imagination and have imagination call us, which is a whole large conversation in and of itself.
I mean, it's a living thread we're in right now, right? This is a dream that's dreaming through each of us and now bringing us together and bringing many other people together. Um, wow, there's so much here. There's so many good threads to go on. Amy, did you want to chime in at all here?
Um, yeah, and nothing's too up for me right now. I think the only piece is like I'm totally with you all in this and share some of that myself. I mean, as you probably all know, I'm deeply close with my wolf hybrids and feel like they're my closest kin in many ways. So I relate to how Holly was speaking to just the interspecies piece. And I think just a constant obsession of mine, and what also tore open this work is, how do we root these beautiful threads of imagination and beautiful inquiry into the inhabitation of sanctuary, and to, yeah, like, it's just always alive in me. How do we do this in the mundane? Because what most interests me is how we, like, something I hear Bio speak to, I've read it in different things, is like, yeah, just washing the washing dishes of sanctuary, the showing up. And like 2 weeks ago, our well broke on the land, and I was down in the well house fixing that. And like, that's my, and I know in our own individual, in our worlds, there's always stuff to fix. There's always things to clean and things like, how is the world of this beautiful inquiry we're in rooted into the day-to-day mundane pieces of our lives? And because that to me is also, it's just ripe with so much sanctuary in life, and teaching. So yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. How is this connected to the mundane? It makes me think about how something we said recently, like even with Únashay, that, the goal is not for Únashay to be an expensive grief spa in the desert. We're talking about hands in the dirt, real human activity together, the business of life, the work of life,
Yeah.
which is a string of moments, you know, put together makes up life or a life. Well,
If I may, since we,
please.
you know, that call to, I shared this invitation to grief at sanctuary, the beautiful poster that we
Yeah.
made, and uh, very great resonance. But a brother in particular, and I don't know if Amy followed through.
I did read some of that. I was like so close to writing something, but I waited.
Was like, oh, here this goes again. Like that, um, he's tired of these kinds of events that charge money,
Mm.
for grieving or something like that. Um, and that he longs for something else, that is it, that is maybe an exploration of grief that has no funding, no money attached to it, maybe open to persons like that. He was gesturing towards a kind of dissatisfaction with an event um, tied to the notion of grief that would still charge money. Of course, lots of persons wrote and said it's not quite that. If you read through, this isn't charging money as such. I mean, they need money to roll this thing out, definitely. Um, However, there are opportunities for people who may not be able to pay for this. But I wanted to speak to this idea of monumentalizing the otherwise, right? And we do it all the time. We expect the new to be so pure, so untethered to the mundane, to the ordinary, to the things that we still have to navigate. We expect it not to pay the bills, right? Right. If this is really a gift of an event, then it should descend from the transcendent and have nothing to do with fixing wells or paying bills, or, it should have nothing to do with that. So I spoke to that, and I remember writing to him that, brother, we can't afford to live pure. And the new will not come from skies. It will come from the messy beneath. It will come from the loam. It's not gonna, we will still have to pay bills with this. And even if there are no wells to fix, the people who are putting their energy to creating this need to eat. And they would need to put food on their tables, and they would need to support other artists who are putting food on their table. So I'm sorry, but this is quite ordinary, and we will have to make do with the ordinary. So I just wanted to push
Yeah.
that in as well.
Thank you. Yeah, I hear that. And I read at least some of your dialogue with him. And, I felt from what I read, he was speaking to something that I have felt deeply. And that is actually a part of the foundational reason I'm doing this work, is that there's not enough, there's not very many reachable spaces. And while it is an organic thing we can experience in our different circles and communities, like, there's not very many, in my experience, intentional held spaces for this ordinary, messy, mundane experience. And yeah, not being someone who comes from wealth, I couldn't find any actual presence to help other than the land, which was so much. I mean, and that could open another conversation. The land and the animals and a couple dear friends held me through some of my more acute experiences. But so much of this work of Únashay is to explore how, like the ordinary and the mess and the fixing of wells and cleaning up of, all of that. Like, it is so entangled in this work. And I feel we have no business doing this work if it's not you know, and so I think he opened up a beautiful inquiry, and we're not at all interested in creating a grief spa out here for wealthy yogis. It's more like real people showing up and exploring this together, all over, you know, a different, like we're wanting to create free residencies for our local neighbors, and yeah, there's a lot to explore there with how it's going to all pan out, but it's a spectrum of how we're making this place accessible.
Yeah, and one
I
of the
love, oh,
things I'll just say one of the things I've heard you say, Amy, is talk about this as a reachable, rooted village care system for all. And go ahead, Holly, jump in.
oh, I just love this conversation. I love the practice of being ordinary, especially in capitalism when we're taught we're supposed to be shiny and all of these things. It's something we talk a lot about in Soulful Life. Like, how do we just be ordinary? And as I said, I just got done with this 5-month grief ritual training with Frances Weller and a few other co-facilitators. And as part of it, there were people from all different backgrounds. There were therapists, group facilitators. There were also just people. And a big question that came through was, do I need to be a therapist to do this work? And I loved Francis's answer because he was like, first off, this is the most ordinary work in the world. And if everyone needed to be a therapist to do this work, we're fucked. Like he literally, and he was like, so no, like all of us can do this work and all of us need to do this work. So I love this thread. And also, a big piece of what we're all talking about is building an underculture of care. So we often talk about this overculture and how it can be quite unhealthy. And then I think about like soul's movement being slow and down and deep, and how if we can build this real foundation or underculture, we can start to do this work in a more steady way or unsteady way. There's also something we've all been touching on that kept coming up for me. I think often about how the work of the settler, like I identify as a white settler, is to be unsettled. And that's also a piece of what we're talking about here. How do we hold each other in that unsettlement? But I love this thread of how do we both look at this as an initiatory experience, which in some ways is a peak experience, but also not be addicted to that, and also look at it as quite ordinary and hold the complexity. A lot of what we're talking about in Sanctuary is how do we hold the complexity of these experiences, of these times. And as people on this screen and who are listening to this, who are grievers, we know that grief is actually quite complex. Like you might be laughing in one moment, and that's actually an expression of grief. And then you might be wailing in the next moment. And then you might be a bit numb in the next moment and a bit confused and all of these things, right? And I think, I know that part of what we're being called to is to hold or understand a deeper complexity.
Mhm. Yes. Which doesn't fit the linear, as Bio was saying earlier. Complexity confounds that. Um, I'm also really feeling like the thread I hear is like we have to grapple with this. We have to grapple with how to make our way out of what has not been functional or well for most of life and into the new. Thinking of that, you know, that person who I guess commented about of grief events charging money and things like that, and I really hear that person's the grief that, yeah, if your sense of village was more intact, you would have had plenty of chances for free to have community grief, to have initiation, to have rites of passage that would have been built in if our sense of village was more intact. But it's been quite taken apart. It's been quite scattered. There's been real damage there. And so now, as these seemingly disparate souls seeking each other again, kind of trying to like magnetize back together, we'll have to grapple with the mundane and the ordinary and the systems that we exist inside of, and that we're both sort of tugging on the threads to allow them to unravel, and also needing parts of them to survive, you know. So the grappling, I think, is well, just how much grace we need for each other in the process, how much we have to be willing to be in process.
I really appreciate what you're saying, and what we're all circling around here is exactly this. If we lived in a healthy village, of course, we wouldn't have to pay for a grief ritual, right? But we don't. And so people who are providing these services, like I have to pay rent. I have to buy food. If we lived in a healthy village, somebody would probably be making the food, and you wouldn't have to pay for those things. And then these ways of life would all just happen. And yet here we are in late capitalism, and we have to reckon with that, and we have to figure out ways to try to make this accessible, and which is part of what we're doing through Únashay, I feel like, is we're trying to find people who might have more resources and disperse that, while also all of us like living our lives. And as someone who does a lot of grief tending and group facilitation, I have come to a place where I'm like, my I don't know how to my work, my services are valuable. And unfortunately in capitalism, part of how we value these things is through money, right? And I wish it was different. I wish there were different ways to do this. And let's imagine into that, which is what I think we're trying to do through Únashay as well, is like, how do we fund some of these things so that people who couldn't otherwise access these? I think that's a beautiful dream.
Yeah.
I'll add to that too. That that brother was he was up in arms against this notion, and I, like Amy, I've been there as well, and him, um, up in arms against this notion of grief as a commodity, right? And we don't want to see grief become commoditized. Get your grief today or something like that. We don't want to. $999.99 or something. We don't want to see it become part of a phantasmagoria, some kind of shopping mall utopia, right? But the other side of that is the same logic when you think about grief as a category, right? And when it's a category, it's removed from the ordinary. It doesn't think in lowercase. It's categorical. It's written in capital letters. So the demand that I don't want to see grief as a commodity, I insist that it be removed from all the material and ordinary and familial ways that we actually navigate the world, is still part of the same logic as seeing it as commodity, right? Like grief is excess. It cannot be categorical. It's excessiveness. And that's why it's so scandalous to modern arrangements, because modernity needs to think in terms of categoricity. These days, even the ways that people protest whiteness or protest capitalism, right? We are longing for categoricity. Like even the minoritarian, it's like, we're going to pull you down. At least we do this in Africa a lot. Let's pull the global north down so that we can take over as the new supremacy, right? So we're in a deadlocked, spiral, a death spiral. And the only thing that breaks out of it is a notion of excess. It's something that spills beyond. Really, I cannot emphasize how important it is, how grief is cosmic and intimate and personological and political and decolonial, all at once.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah, absolutely. Just one quick thing to speak to is like, in this work of Únashay, I actually dream and hope that sometime in my lifetime, I'll get to witness that we don't even have to be under this guise as a nonprofit, or to have these fundraisers or whatever invitation to, while maybe that will always be in my timeline here. But what I'm trying to speak to is like, I want to invoke this ripple from that deeper, like excessive tide that grief is, and that it leads to and pulls up in all of us. I want it to just take over, and for culture to, yeah, find more ways to, yeah, I guess, just like collectively remember and realize this is a part of who we are. And it's something, while it, yes, the devastation piece, and like, it's terrible, and it's a portal as well that actually opens up our love and adds to it. And like, yeah, someday I'd love to, of course, not need these different frameworks of being a nonprofit or this or that, but I'm willing to work within these, what do you call them? Just to use these tools for now to hopefully, you know, release that wave all the more into our collective conversation. And yeah, just let it take over and take its own form beyond us. So,
Mhm.
yeah.
Mhm. Mhm. In the thread of what's in the thread of the ordinary, I'm just thinking about something that happens a lot in holding space with people, and in, particularly in being a counselor, is, and for, over a decade of watching people, it's a kind of a phenomenon that happens where um, someone starts to cry or starts to have an emotion, and they'll pause themselves to pull it back together. Just give me a second,
Mhm.
to
Mhm.
and I'm always sort of amazed in that moment. I can understand all the reasons why that would happen. It's vulnerable, maybe we're still forming relationship, but I'm always amazed because in my mind I'm like, we just worked so hard to get to the point where you could come undone. We just
Mm.
worked so hard to get to the threshold where we could say we don't actually know what's going to happen next. I don't know what's going to move through you, and it's so alive. It's a river, Únashay, really, the metaphor of the river is so, and the reality of the river is so with us in this work. And I hear each of you kind of offering that invitation in a way of that. Bio, what I heard from what you said was there's an abundance in life. Life is abundant in a way that is kind of terrifying, in the way that a river is abundant, a rushing river is abundant, and it's terrifying. And
Mm.
it will carry you, it will carry us, it will move. And it has connection to every other tributary and to all the banks and and so it's like, we're not talking about the small abundance of can people give a little, can I find my inner generosity? It's like, can I plug back into this wild current that actually life is vastly abundant, and grief included is vastly abundant. This is not a sanitized category, as you're saying. Um, this is not a little sectioned off area we need for this thing that we sort of need to do so you can pull yourself back together and come back into this thing that we've been doing for so long. We're actually talking about comfort with, or increasing trust in something much more fluid.
Mm.
I call it a prior generosity, a a prior generosity that is, we enter a space and we feel, oh, I have to show my degree to be worth anyone's attention. I have to show that I'm eloquent. I have to show this. A prior generosity speaks about the ways that we don't have to linger in those impoverished notions of the apparent. Whiteness is the orthodoxy of the apparent, right? It's only what appears that is available. But it is often the case that those things that are invisible form this wonderful thresholding space, and it includes grief and terror, but it is poetry, right? It's the idea that, sometimes we don't have to say everything, that someone else will fill the gaps, that someone else will finish our sentences for us, that we don't have to put up all the fires to keep ourselves warm, that another body will be there to hold us, right? This is the richness that modernity doesn't know how to hold space for. And yeah, this prior generosity is what we want to seek into.
I love this. I love talking to people in their genius, talking to people where this is obviously what we're all living into. And everything y'all are saying reminds me of the conversation around self-regulation. Like there's this whole conversation in trauma circles around regulated nervous system, co-regulation. I feel allergic to the word regulation. I was actually in a conflict with a friend recently and they were like, I'm regulated, I'm blah, blah. And I was like, what if you were a little less regulated? Like, what if we were a little less regulated together? And part of this for me is I think the conversation, I'm not saying people shouldn't do nervous system work. I'm not saying that that whole concept should be thrown out. But when we talk about attachment, when we talk about nervous system regulation, it's so individualized or within a couple. And I'm really into yesterday I was sitting with the creek. I'm apprenticing with the creek. And I was like, I'm co-regulating with the creek. How do I build secure attachment with the land I'm on? How do I build secure attachment with the third bodies I'm a part of? And part of what you were just talking to, Bio, is something that lights me up so much, which is about the wisdom that comes through a group and a third body being any of the space between us, the third body of the four of us right now. And that to me is the wisdom we need right now. It's not going to come just from me. And this third body being so much bigger, being the cosmos, right? Like I also do a lot of work with the planet Saturn, like as a being. And I'm really into like, what's the third body between Saturn and me, Saturn and all of us, right? And I just think so much of our work around this is so myopic, is so closed. And if we can open it up, like if we're talking about co-regulation on in a much larger field, I'm into that. But if we're talking about like self-regulation, I'm just bleh. Like I just can't do it anymore. And we're not built to do that. And I just don't think that's what we're evolving into.
That's such a big thread. I love it. Because there's this funny thing about like, or the paradox is the truth. Yeah. So it's like we're talking about dismantling things, like letting them get a little more wild, a little more like crunchy and freaky and un um without a label. And then here we are also asking ourselves the question of, and how do we build a space that really holds people with dignity, integrity, and respect in that divine work of coming apart, in that divine work of losing the language you were given so that you can listen in for the original language or the deeper language that maybe you haven't even heard, that you're remembering through yourself, through your ancestry, through the land that maybe you've never even heard yourself. Maybe you speak river and you don't know it. Maybe you speak lightning and you don't know it. Maybe you actually know the language of grief in a way that that is a gift to you, as Bio said earlier. That is a resource that you carry. And so I'm really feeling also the paradox again of, okay, so we're building structures for people to become structureless. We're building containers so that we can overflow them. Like what an incredibly strange thing that we're up to. And yet somehow, I'll say for the four of us and the many we're connected to, this is the impulse right now, is to in some ways build things that we will shatter. we will we will overflow, we will go beyond.
It's my son who is autistic, who is not a master, a neurotypical master at self-regulation, who is a critique of self-regulation, going around in circles. And just before I left home, he was going around in circles again. So I paused from what I was doing and I just turned to him as he was going round in circles in front of me. And I said, why do you do that? Why do you go around in circles? And he had this cheeky smile, like he knew what was up, but he wasn't going to tell me everything. And he had this glint in his eye and he looked at me and said, that's because I want to draw a big O on the ground. And that was it. That was it. That was all he said, but he smiled. The way he smiled when he said it was like, I'm not telling you everything, and I'm not going to satisfy your cognitive needs to to capture. This is not going to be eloquent stuff. And said, I want to draw a big O on the ground with my feet. And I feel there's something about that feels like this idea of, we're building and we are also tearing down. And it's not a we, it doesn't start with individual selves doing this. This is not a manifesto or another agenda. This is about the forces at large, the effective differentiation that is compelling us to move in the world in certain ways, to reach out and touch the autistic politics that doesn't want to cohere with or speak truth to power. We need speaking truth to power, but we need something else too. We need safety, but we need something else too.
Mhm.
We need diversity and representation, but we need to go beyond that as well. So these are the tensions in the field, right? Drawing circles on the ground.
Well, and that's the exact ritual that was needed in that moment. Like, I am convinced that it's not just him that's,
Right.
like, doing that ritual, right? Maybe there's an ancestor, maybe the literal ground is like, "This is what I need in this moment." And how beautiful that he's in touch with that in a way that a lot of us adults or whatever we want aren't, right?
Yeah.
Like, anyways, that is so fascinating to me and so beautiful to me.
And yeah, and
Yeah.
this is, go ahead, Amy.
Well, I mean, this conversation is so touching into just how music has been for me and how I feel before I came to this. I mean, as I've said, this notion of grief and sanctuary, it's been with me long before I went through my losses. Um, but I was mainly, my main channel of moving in the world has been music. And I often feel when you're writing a song and when you're sharing that music, it's almost as if like there's this sort of kind of creating of there's a hollow inside the song and an invitation for the other musicians that are playing with, like we're almost protecting that hollow inside and like a sort of silence that creates the notes that are built around it. And in that silence, in that hollow, just some like the deeper wisdom, the deeper tidal energy comes through. And to me, I don't see any separation between how I have experienced music and this work of like, yeah, we can talk and there's there are so many things to explore and speak to within the structure and this notion of build. What does it look like to build some sort of well-held vessel for people here at Únashay? And yet also it's complete mystery, and what's going to come through that hollow space of being together in this is so far beyond us. It's a creature that thankfully it has so much more to say than I or we do, and it has more work to do beyond just us. So I yeah, I just wanted to name that because it feels very close to how I've experienced music.
Yeah, I love this because the little chaos agent in me is always like loves when the question changes. There, I found this beautiful edge in therapeutic work, which is when we get enough rapport, when we feel enough familiarity together, when there's friendship and kinship between us, when the work's moving along, when you're coming out of the habit of your pain, and maybe life is starting to feel a little more, you're feeling a little more in the seat of your life, the question changes. So then we're not in how does the pain stop, or how do I stop experiencing this, or how does this, and the question actually starts to become, well, how good could this get? Like, how good could this get between us? What do we not know yet about this connection? What could we do in this time we have together? Like, the question becomes generative. It opens into what's generative and not so much into just, how do we make something stop? And I think that question, though, why it's interesting to me is because it takes practice to learn to hold pain and grief, and it takes just as much practice to learn to hold the charge of feeling good, of feeling connected. And why this feels so relevant to me with our conversation is, these wild spaces that we're inviting people to come undone, to loosen the laces, occupy a little more of one's own body and the space around, and feel how big your breath can actually get, feel how big your sound can be, your wail. That invitation to me means like something might move through you that might have a charge that could be alarming, beautifully alarming. Like the current of universal love could move through you, actually. And we don't know what will happen. That comes back to the beginning of the conversation. We don't know what that will mean for your life and for our collective life together and for our earth. When this loosens, when more moves through, when the river moves through, when the lightning moves through, when the creek becomes, one with Holly's body, when the donkey whales are moving, when when the wolf in you, Amy, is like howls, that we actually, the practice of holding, of getting, I don't know, my body keeps wanting to do this, to allow the question to change of how good could this get to? What could we stand to gain actually from this fruitful confusion, from the disorientation, from the letting go of the categories? What might choose to move through us, and what kind of beautiful chaos might that bring in to ordinary moments? I'm just briefly thinking of when I go grocery shopping with my partner. He stops and talks to everybody, and he does our grocery shopping. So it's like every, 5 trips I go with him or whatever. And I'm always like, we're stopping to talk to all these people who work at the co-op grocery store. And it slows things down. But I realized pretty quickly what he was up to. It's like, that's that beautiful chaos of like, well, how good could this get? This moment that we have right now, the only one where we're alive, actually, you and me, human together in this space. This is the container we have. And have we even explored the possibility, So he has all these friends at the co-op that we don't hang out with. We don't know them, but he knows them. And the trip is slowed down. The mission of the grocery store becomes something completely different. So I think about that kind of ordinariness, not happening out of pity or sort of like, oh, we're supposed to connect. We're supposed to say hi to our neighbors. We're supposed to say, how are you doing? But just out of genuine, radical possibility that is seated inside of every moment. I mean, that is sometimes overwhelming for me to really acknowledge.
Yeah. This is speaking so much to, I think, Bio, you said earlier, like healing can be a form of self-hatred, healing, however we want to say it. And I'm orienting so much more these days towards relationship, whatever that relationship with people at the grocery store, relationship with, the land beneath me, relationship with donkeys, all of these things. And part of what you're talking about within all of this that I love, maybe this is where we land in this conversation a bit, is like how I've been taught to hold grief in one hand and gratitude in the other, and to be stretched wide by the two. And it's sort of like, how large can I get in my aliveness, in myself, by being stretched by those things? So that that posture that you took, Jesse, where you kept kind of being like, this is what I want to do. Right. And that is what our soul is calling us towards, is like, how do we live into our largest calling, which I think does, and we could call it gratitude, we can call it celebration, we can call it praise, we can call it awe. Like I think one of the things that we're supposed to do as humans is be in awe of what's around us, and really just like stand with our mouths wide open. And so I think for me, this is a beautiful place to land with grief, and also say, like, how good could this get? And I also want to say, as someone who has a sort of melancholic personality, it is for sure that at times joy is as hard or harder for me. Like, I've had moments where I'm like, am I okay? Am I like, is something wrong? And then I'm like, oh, I'm just happy. Like, and I'm like, and I have to practice that as well. So I love that being a part of the conversation, and especially after we had just talked about wild expression and music and being together, right? Because part of what we're talking about is primary satisfactions and how do we commune instead of consume, right? And so, like, how, and part of building living culture is really easing into or practicing these primary satisfactions together. So I love this.
And I know that I just want to pause for a practical piece. We said we would go till, are we about at an ending time?
I don't know.
Okay, so I think we probably are. Well, Bio, I just wondered if you'll probably have to hop off quicker than all of us, I'm imagining, with your schedule. And so,
Sure.
all right.
Just to give, I started with gratitude. It's only pertinent and appropriate to end with gratitude. This has been a ravishingly beautiful time with you, my sisters, and I I'm reminded not just from everything you said, Holly and Amy and Jesse, and thank you especially to Jesse for holding this as you did.
Yes.
Um, I'm reminded again by that image of my son going around in a circle and smiling, and Holly saying that, hey, maybe that's what the world wants to do. Maybe that's what, other forces want to do. To hell with self-regulation, I'm reminded, I'm reminded, I'm reminded uh, of this thing that I wrote in my journal after I had that moment with my son, that maybe impairment um, is a form of repair. That repair, the way we think about repair, I want to put a slash between re and pair. Like it's about pairing and forming new alliances, and it's in those places that we've called impairing, right? That affords us the gift of repair, of new kinds of worlds, new kinds of possibilities. So, yeah, I'm going to be going around in a circle, and I'm looking forward to um, what we create and what we are created by when we meet in New Mexico very
Yeah.
soon. Thank you so much.
Mhm.
Thank you, Bio.
Thank you, Bio. It'll be so good to be together in
Yeah.
in the 3D and beyond in April.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for joining us for this incredible time. I'd love to end here with a beautiful vision, which will become a reality, in fact. So on April 20th, 2024, we are gathering 200 or so people, and we'll come together on the land that is Únashay, and we'll be moving through a day of deep community, of land intimacy, of praise and grief, um, all together. So we'll have Bio will be attending. We'll be so honored to have him there offering a community talk. This is a beautiful chance to hear Bio in stereo. We're also so blessed to have Holly Trular guiding us through community ritual and land offerings. Um, and I'll be offering some vibrant song alongside my partner, and we do community singing. So this will be a time to sing together in Mass, which is a really transcendent experience if you've never had it before. And Amy will be welcoming us into this incredible visionary space so that we can dream into what another pathway through these times might look like. There'll be time to visit the land of Únashay and see what's happening on the ground. And that's really just the icing on the cake. So truly we'll be surrounded by some incredible artists, elders, grief tenders, some true magicians in this time. I'm really excited for this event. And there is a way you can attend. So if you check out the link below, you'll see a link that you can either buy a ticket to the event to come be with us in person, or there's a way to give remotely. So you'll see a Give Butter link, and that is where we're fundraising for completion of land infrastructure, for resources to host grief residencies, for grief cafes, and more. So please check out unashayhome.com for more info. Incredible website, such a work of art, so much info on there. And if you're not able to attend live, we will also be offering a beautiful digital resource gift that we're putting together to folks far and wide just in gratitude for donations and gifts that are sent to Únashay. So this is going to include extended audio from this interview and beyond, songs, guided practices, and more. So please stay tuned for that. And we offer so much gratitude for your generosity and for dreaming alongside us in these times. Thank you.